Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1198th New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Lynne Tillman and James Yeh. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Lynne Tillman's novels include Haunted Houses, Motion Sickness, No Lease on Life, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, American Genius, a comedy, and Men and Apparitions. Other books include The Velvet Years, Warhol's Factory, 1965 to 1967, What Would Lynne Tillman Do, Someday This Will Be Funny, MOTHERCARE, and Thrilled to Death, the subject of today's conversation. She is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and the Katherine Anne Porter Award. And our host today, James Yeh, is a writer, editor, journalist, and educator. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Drift, The Guardian, among other places. A two-time MacDowell Fellow, he is the recipient of fellowship from Center for Fiction, the Hub City Writers Project, and the Black Mountain Institute. A former editor at McSweeney's Quarterly, The Believer, and Vice, he currently teaches writing at Columbia University and Center for Fiction. He lives in Brooklyn, where he is at work on a novel. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lynne to get us started with the reading.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you to my editors. Thank you to James Yeh, with whom we'll have a conversation after this. And I met James at MacDowell. I don't even remember when, but as he will admit, I taught him to play ping pong much better than he does, because I played ping pong from when I was a young child and had a pretty good slam. I don't know about it now. Anyway, I'm going to read. So Thrilled to Death is a book of 41 stories culled from 35 years of writing stories, and it's a selection of these stories, and they're all different lengths and different styles, and it's a real potpourri, you could say. So I'm going to read one of the shortest, and it's called Contingencies. And Contingencies is based on a Raymond Queneau book of exercises in fiction, in writing, and New Directions republished it I guess 10 years ago, something like that, I can't remember. And he had taken the same story and written it 100 different ways. And it's pretty exciting to see how many different ways you can write. And it's something that is important to understand, that the way that you write is not the only way you could write. There are many different ways to write. There's not one style, I believe. Okay, it's called Contingencies. At dinner with so-called intelligent people, during our discussion of the Marquis de Sade, I recognized a common lunacy, the fairy tale of absolute and complete freedom. People don't know what to do with the freedom they have, I announced, and trounced off as if insulted. Today I took a bus, a random bus, no particular number, a white and blue bus or a pale green. No matter, it was a bus and I took it. First I stood in line with everyone else, a citizen of a city standing peacefully waiting for public transport, a condition of urban life. I heard two men, no particular men, or maybe very particular men, but not to me. I took the bus anyway. The men were discussing their office, where they seemed mad about a woman, and I listened because I could. They described her in broad terms. She's got big tits. Oh my God, that ass, shit. I entered the bus, paid my fare. The driver said nothing, and unencumbered except by my hopes and dreams and desires, I walked to the back of the bus. My eyes roving, checking for free seats, and there were good reasons why I kept moving and took the seat I chose, but these are insignificant reasons, except to me. I found a seat all to myself, sat down, exhaling freely and happily, because I celebrate public buses, especially when I have my own seat next to a window. But then the two men, still exclaiming about the woman's ass and tits, took the seats behind me. Now I felt hindered also by their bulk and hulk, as well as their boisterous voices, bellows about asses and tits, and if I hadn't known myself as myself, if I didn't understand the invisible boundaries in which I existed with my freedom, I would have assaulted the men. I was bigger than both and freer, and a black belt in karate. Before I had the chance to pummel one or both, because I was at liberty to do what I wanted, even if it meant imprisonment for a day or two, the two men stopped their bellows and instead turned to watch two other male passengers nearly come to blows, one jostling the other for a seat. Now the three of us, the tits and ass men and myself, alarmed by this altercation, became a community of sorts. Suddenly I heard a rip, certainly a rent of some kind, that made a decided sound in the air. The man who had jostled the first for a seat, now watched by the newly formed society of the three of us, took that prized seat. Oh, I thought, and wondered what my two companions thought. It was a strange day, and one has such strange freedoms, for I could have ridden that bus the entire day until it ended its journeys, or until the bus driver informed me that I had to get off. Any number of possibilities presented themselves to me. I could even have fought him to remain. But thinking it over, I watched all the people I had known, in a sense, on the bus, as they removed themselves from it. I was alone again with my thoughts, not bothered by anything, and when the bus stopped near a park, one I had never visited, I leaped off violently. Again the driver said nothing, but now I took his silence to mean assent, and even understanding, and walked toward the park and into it through its wide gates, and sat down, this time at a cafe, where I discovered that the man who had been jostled on the bus earlier in the day was being advised by another to patch his overcoat, a dark brown parka, the same one he had worn on the bus. A piece of fabric hung from its hem. It may have come down during that altercation. Now, I thought, he's having an alteration, and wondered if this linguistic association occurred to him as well. Here we are, I remember thinking, in a great chain of being, and he could think whatever he wanted. I pretended not to notice him, naturally. Thank you.
Yeah.
James.
That's great, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks to the Brooklyn Rail for facilitating, and obviously thanks to you, Lynn, for taking the time and to join us and be in conversation. So we're here kind of on the occasion of Thrilled to Death, your new collection of stories. And it's a selected story collection, right? It's a collection of selected stories that pulls from over 4 decades of your short fiction. And I was curious, so in the promotional materials, this collection is described as having been curated by the author. And Lynn, I was wondering if you'd tell us a little bit about what this experience was like, being the curator of a Lynne Tillman retrospective, as it were, and was this an enjoyable role for you? Was it challenging? Was it surprising? Alienating? I don't know. I wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
I was helped because when I first looked at all of these, or began to look at all of these stories, I was, of course, surprised that I had written so many. And I felt a bit overwhelmed. And I asked my former publisher and editor, Richard Nash, uh, who, who had helped my career and me enormously when he first published American Genius, a Comedy in 2006, when no one else would have done it. And he knew my writing, and he said he would read all of the stories. So I had somebody who was watching them, also reading them, watching them, and because it's very hard to make that selection. And, you know, I'm quite self-critical, and I wanted to know if this stood up, you know, if this could stand. We call it the test of time, but I don't know that that's an appropriate metaphor, test of time. I mean, we're always being tested, aren't we? But maybe it's always in time. I don't know. We can we can argue about it, but and he helped me a lot. There were some things I would not have put in that he wanted to put in, and there are other things I think that I wanted to put in that perhaps he didn't want to put in. But he's very, very gentlemanly and didn't say, and was never rude to me. We just discussed things. But I wanted his opinion, and because I think it's very hard to judge your own work. I think about the importance of selected volumes, especially for poets. That's a huge deal in all the poets' lives I know. That moment when they have a selected book, it gets more attention than anything else. And a collection, of course, helps, because most people have never read my stories, maybe some of them, but they appear in odd places, and that's fine with me, except nobody sees them.
Just that's on a related note, right? So you mentioned, right, we've been talking about how this collection is selected, right, and not collected, as sometimes happens. And, unlike a lot of these sort of career spanning collections, this one's not arranged chronologically. And instead, you've talked about wanting something that was more associative, thematic perhaps, and to deny a sense of progress. And,
Yes,
I thought that
yes,
was so fascinating. I was wondering if you might be willing to, explain your thought process there a bit more.
of course. Um, I've always been annoyed by the idea, and as postmodernists, we should all know that progress isn't necessarily a product of moving on in time. So I didn't want to say because I'd written this story in 1994, it wasn't as good as a story I'd written in 2022. Because we might get better, we might get worse, and also because my stories are quite different from each other, many of them. And so chronology didn't make sense in that way either. It wasn't like I could lump them together under titles or in sections. And so the associative idea is also part of the way I write, associatively from one word to another, and imagery and so on. And yeah, I'm in opposition to the idea that we get better.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I'm curious if I can ask, and I have some ideas like which stories might be earlier or later. And, I was wondering if it's not listed in the book itself, but if you'd be willing to disclose here which of these stories was the earliest.
Um, Myself as a Menu, the
Oh,
first,
wow.
my first published story.
Wow. And when was that published?
That's early. That was published, I think it was 1979, and that went into a magazine no one saw, I'm sure, called Wallpaper. It was done in London, and Susan Hiller a great artist, and David Coxhead and some others, artists and writers, put together this magazine, Wallpaper, and Wallpaper actually had wallpaper as cover, so each issue was different. And they asked me to contribute. And I somehow immediately thought of, because it was going to be visual, myself as a menu. And then I decided I would, of course, use a menu. That was be the visuals. And at that time, there used to be a restaurant at the base of the Empire State Building called Longchamps. And it was a sort of businessman's ladies' lunch restaurant. And I walked over to it, and the maitre d', who was in a tuxedo, is noon before the lunch crowd. And I said, I'm doing an art project, and I'd like to have a Longchamps menu. And he said, lunch or dinner? I said, dinner. And that's how that worked. And I wrote some things, some quite disconnected, some not, and put them in the different boxes, appetizers, sides, I don't know, whatever. And it was fun. And the original, I think, is in the Fales Library in my archive.
I mean, your response makes me think, I'm like, okay, I was going to ask you what was like the most recent one, but then it also makes me, and this is like, I feel like a little bit of like having spent so much, well, it's the nature of life in a lot of ways too, but, I'm like, oh, well, it seems like you've had a lot of, fruitful collaborations with artists and over the years.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I guess maybe this is like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious, like, how important is, the process of going to see art, being in conversations with artists and artworks, how does that inform your own work? Is it, yeah, like how much do you, if you're blocked, if you're like stuck on something, do you say, okay, this is a great time to go see this artwork?
I don't know, James, that I had put it to myself like that. I can't write, I'll go to a gallery kind of thing. But visual art is very important to me. And obviously starting with movies and television from when I was a kid. But I took all my electives in studio art when I was at Hunter College, and I had some great teachers in the art department. So I was an English major and American history minor, but all my electives were in studio art. And I was in that department, which was on the top floor at Hunter College, and I was the only non-art major. And so I had no experience. I hadn't taken any other classes. And learning to do watercolors, learning to paint in oils at that time, helped me understand another idea about composition, about space, about juxtaposition. All of these different, obviously color, all of these elements in making art. I couldn't do sculpture to save my life. I tried once to make a sculpture of torn books, and it just fell flat all the time. I couldn't make it stand up. And being in front of a canvas, the blank canvas, not the blank page, was an entirely different experience. I could feel my brain working differently. I could sense that that space needed to be filled in whatever way I was going to do it. It had to be addressed. And it was very different from writing. But I learned things from doing that. And I was not an art historian. I don't think of myself as an art critic, but I did steep myself in looking at art and, of course, film. And it came into my writing. When I was making a film called Committed about Frances Farmer, in the editing room, the realization that you could put two pieces of film together that weren't necessarily in line with each other, but the eye would create the relationship. It was sort of amazing how the brain, which is, of course, operating the eyes, allows you to do that. And I realized I was writing haunted houses at that time and taking a big break from it to work on Committed. I realized that I could fool the reader in a similar way. In other words, I was very bored by the idea of having to set something up. And I thought, well, the reader will make sense of some of these elisions and some of the way I have put together these paragraphs and how they bump up against each other to create meaning. I mean, not meaning that I could control, of course. So I learned things from those mediums, and going to and look at art allows me to think in other ways. And I know that comes into my writing, but I can't be specific about it. I can't say this, this, and this.
I mean, the people use the term craft of fiction, like that's like the craft of writing, the craft of fiction. And then you brought in a word, I thought it was really, you brought in the idea of composition. I mean, do you think of more of it as like the composition of fiction in when you're writing as opposed to the craft? Or do they go hand in hand, or,
Well,
are
you can't make a composition without writing. So you have to have the craft is involved always, but in a way, craft should be invisible.
Mhm.
If you think about drawings or paintings, how sometimes a painter will leave some of the original marks under a painting that they've painted over them, or they're leaving spaces. That's deliberate. I think craft is about being deliberate
Mm.
in how you write something, but I don't want a reader to be fixed on the craft. I want the craft in a way, the way movie music, probably that's a horrible analogy, is not to be heard when you're watching something. And I work very hard at craft, and in that I'm very particular about placement, about word choice, about all of these things. And so something that might appear to be loosely written is actually very deliberately written. I got a very terrible review, which I never read completely because I was told not to, by someone called Laura or Laura, anyway, doesn't know anything about fiction apparently. And it was in the New York Review of Books, the only time I've ever been reviewed in the New York Review of Books. And she writes that she and I are the same. Starts out by apparently we're the same, except that Lynn does this and I do that. I think she's a sociologist. And she goes on to say that she's edited and I'm not edited. That's what she thinks. This is how you know she knows nothing, certainly nothing about fiction. And she thinks that because I do things in writing that she would never be allowed to do, you know? Well, freedom is what you take, isn't it?
Mm.
And she could be a much better writer. I'm reading Sadia Hartman now, who's working with nonfiction and fiction, and she's a much, much better much, much better woman. Yes, that too, I'm sure. She's a much better writer than this woman, whose name I can't remember. So yes, craft is important. Where you place a preposition, where you place your adverb, where you place your adjective, how you start a sentence, all of these things matter intensely. But I don't want that to be what is most obvious about the writing. I mean, what I just read, contingencies, I mean, it's full of crafty kind of things. But I would rather the reader be amused
Yeah.
than troubled.
Mm-mm. Of course, yeah. Um, yeah, that's great. And well, and you, I mean, there's always, I feel like there's so many paths we could go from each of your answers, which is so lovely. And and I almost feel like it's a weird responsibility slash power or freedom, as you say. Freedom is what you take, which is a really lovely. I mean, the idea of freedom, and then also the boundaries, the constraints, is something that story, especially when you were reading it, I was, newly drawn or freshly drawn to that idea. I know you've talked about how ethics play such a big role in your writing.
Mhm.
You know, um, sort of like what to do, and then reflecting on or analyzing what you do and, what you believe, the sort of principles you have, and then what we actually do, right?
Mhm.
And, I mean, that reminds me of, well, it also reminds me of like one of my favorite stories of yours, which we've talked a little bit about in the past, but what is it? That's How Wrong My Love Is, the one
Yes.
about the mourning doves, and right, you have this character um who's professes to be an animal lover. She spends this whole really great story kind of looking closely at these mourning doves that are on her windowsill, and yet she's kind of like at the end, well, I rarely resist roast chicken, like, and yeah, I mean, I guess it's I didn't have a question exactly right there, but it does make me just think like, well, I guess it's like the tensions between freedom and and constraint. How do you as a writer go about like making that into something that's pleasurable, not troubling, right? For the
Uh,
reader.
That's that's a good question. I mean, there are many ways to approach it, and so I'm thinking which is the best way. But of course, there's not necessarily a best way. There's just one way. You can't speak in three languages at the same time, and that's why I wish, I could be a writer who was writing like a composer of music, where you hear all these different tones and undertones and the constraint, of course, is something that came out. The idea of the constraint is something that Oulipo, which Raymond Queneau it was part of, used. So they would say, write a piece that used the seventh meaning of a noun, or choose your noun, something like that, and exercise in style. That was the name of the Queneau book, Exercises in Style. And there are always constraints, the first of which is your mind and, the way you think. I like to challenge the way I think, although I can never completely get over myself in that sense. I can never entirely contradict everything that I think. because some of it is so embedded I don't know. But in writing, there is some freedom where there's less freedom in most other things in our life. Although now, given what we're living in, who knows what's going to happen. But it is happening. So you have choice in writing. You have more choices. They're more obvious in writing than in a lot of other things that you do. I mean, you could say, well, I choose to go to this college if it lets me in. But that choice, embedded in that choice, is your environment, your education, your family background, its income. All of these things go into what you call choice. So it's never free of context.
Mm.
I'm going far afield, and now I'm really not sure how to get back
Oh,
to.
yeah, that's probably my strange guidance there. I'm taking maybe too many freedoms here.
No, no, no,
I'll
take
try to
them.
draw us, I'll try to corral us back. Thank you for indulging me there. Well, maybe we could get to something more concrete for now, and then we can go back to going afield, which is, I think, what the fun of reading, and especially one of the joys, I think, of your work is you could be reading what seems like almost like a hard-boiled story about like New York, kind of like these city life, and then suddenly we're also thinking about Freud or and these like really heady ideas. And then there's like a TV ad that like jars in, or like the language that way. But well, you know, I guess I'm curious. This is a wide range of stories, and over the course of many years, like, I'm curious, do you write every day? Do you, is there, how long does it take to write, let's say, a quintessential Lynne Tillman story? Has this evolved a lot over the years?
Well, what has evolved is my compulsion
Mm,
and my my compulsion to finish
mm,
something, and my fear of not getting started. In college, I could never write my college essays, and I would bargain with my teacher. If I write one and don't write the other, could you give me a C if I get an A on the first, or something like that? And, I think they mostly were very kind to this oddball in their class and allowed that. Um, but it's hard to say. Do I write every day? No. Do I want to write every day? Yes. Publishing a book is the worst thing for writing because writing is different from having a book come out. And so I haven't been able to focus on on my writing in days and days. I do feel less myself when I don't write. I'm not as disciplined as many, many writers. I don't stand up while I'm writing like some male writer is very famous for doing. All of these, all of these things. And deadlines do help me get something done because, as I said, I've become compulsive in that way. And my fear is always that I will just not write it. And so the fear is greater than my procrastination. My last novel, Men and Apparitions, took me about 10 years to finish. Now, why was that? Many times I wanted to stop and give it up, but the story that I was trying to tell, to narrate what it means to live in a glut of images, was incredible. How do you narrate? How do you tell that story? it's a phrase or sentence that we have been using for 40, 50 years. We live in a glut of images. And of course, the glut has only gotten more glutty because of the internet and our phones and all of this. And so I was interested in a number of things. I have a male narrator. His name is Zeke, or Ezekiel, and he's an ethnomethodologist, and he's studying family photographs. And that is a way for me to then bring in his family, his provenance, with Clover Hooper Adams, who was a photographer in the mid-1940s, 50s, 60s, Henry Adams' wife, who committed suicide. That allowed me to bring in to the story suicide, which I was very interested in. How do you write that without being mawkish? And then death. I was very interested in people who take care of the dying. I was very interested in the new man, so-called, men who were raised under the sign of feminism and the women's movement. Maybe their mothers were feminists. And how did they think about themselves as men, in quotes, and women, in quotes? So all of that, and the history of photography. I took a graduate course. I sat in on a graduate course in photography, the history of photography. I read Henry Adams' novels that he wrote under a pseudonym, and so on. I did all of this research in order to feel that I had enough information to write this book. And because I'd studied sociology in graduate school, I was really, I thought I could handle these different aspects. I thought I could talk about that. So it took me years to write that book. And going to the point you were making, or the point I'm making, I'm forgetting whose points are whose points are whose at this point. I did want to stop many times. I was teaching both semesters, and the summer, as any writer can tell you who's also teaching, goes, it's mid-May, oh, I have this time to write. And then suddenly it's mid-July and you haven't done anything. You haven't cracked it in any way. So yeah, I have a compulsion to get something done. And I also don't feel myself if I'm not writing. But then I don't write every day. Although I can't say that I'm not thinking about it every day. Yeah.
I had a couple more questions, and then I think there's also going to be the Q&A, and then also, I know you also had a song you want to play too, but I'm getting too far ahead of us. But anyway, well, so some of my favorite moments in this collection involved misunderstandings between characters, right? And Christine Smallwood talks about this great one, points us to it, the sort of the nearsighted woman who learns that the man she thinks she's flirting with at the bar is, like, spoiler, is just a stain on the wall, right? There's another character who can't understand why her friend keeps hanging up on her. It turns out there's like an issue with, like, a mechanical issue with the payphone, and I'm curious if you could talk about these stories or this kind of story a bit more. What is it that draws you to these moments of misunderstanding in terms of, like, as a site for potential literature?
Well, communication is very, very difficult. I think mostly and often we misunderstand each other because every word has associations, obviously a denotation and intonations and all of this. And people, when they're talking to each other, hear other things than what perhaps the other person is saying. Also, people don't really listen to each other. They may listen but not hear, which is more active, right? You can listen but not hear, if I can make that distinction. And you may not hear some kind of underlying emotion. You may not be able to feel what the other person is feeling. And don't get me started on empathy. Many people think they have empathy or whatever that is, and I say no. A lot of people have no understanding of what other people are feeling. They're too worried about what they're feeling or thinking. That's why conversation is, to me, so important, because I want to know what other people are thinking and feeling. And it's one of the reasons that I find reading a novel, a good novel, is so important, because that's where consciousness happens, contemporary consciousness. Even in a historical novel, so called, you'll have a contemporary consciousness that's directing it. So I think people don't understand each other. Sometimes it's willful, but most times I think it's involuntary. And if you have a point to make in a conversation, then you're not able to hear the other person.
Mm.
You learn that from interviewing. At a certain point, I was doing a lot of interviews for the Velvet Years book and for the bookstore book. And then I do a lot of conversations with artists also. And it's really about listening and hearing what they're saying, not thinking, what am I going to say?
Yeah, yeah.
How, and that's hard, because I'll always go into a conversation, a public conversation, with 10 comments or 10 things that I can rely on if suddenly I blank. And sometimes I do blank and I can't remember whose name is what or something like that. But then in a true conversation, you have to get rid of what you want to say, because you're listening to the other person and then you're trying to respond to that. And that's what makes conversation hard. I mean, James, we're having a conversation and you were really trying to converse with me, to hear what I'm saying, and then you have to reorder your own thoughts
Sure.
in order to answer or think about another question and so on. So conversation is unwieldy. I think of conversations rather than interviews. An interview, the way we see them on television or whatever, are usually so boring, because it's just straight up. You have to be able to be thrown off, you know, thrown off what you want to say.
Well, I had a couple different responses, but it makes me think, well, first of all, that's a very empathetic response. Um, um, uh, I feel seen as the interviewer or conversation partner. And it also reminded me of something, since our last like public quote unquote conversation, I've become a father, and something that was
Oh,
so.
I didn't know that.
Oh, what? Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess maybe I didn't. Anyway, so that has happened. We can talk more about that outside of this. But my son said this very damning thing to me about a year ago. He's around 2, and he was like, Baba James doesn't listen to me. And I was,
Oh,
and
wow.
and I was trying because I was trying to figure out why he had the sourness toward me, and he lives with his mom, and I don't think it was, I know she's doesn't want him to have like bad vibes toward me, and so I was just why what am I doing? And I tried to and he had this I had this thing where I would listen to him, but it was like part way, like I would basically, and he wasn't always speaking clearly. There's a large height difference, just like mechanically it's not always easy to hear him. But I would hear some halfway and I'd kind of make a joke and say something slightly off, like that was like in a response, and it really upset him. He really didn't like that I would kind of partly get it. And anyway, so like that was
That's
sure.
really fascinating.
Yeah.
That a 2-year-old understands why he's pissed off, you know.
He's very precocious that way. I think, he says things like, "I'm not angry, I'm frustrated."
Wow,
That might
wow.
be like 3-year-old level at his point, but these communication things are so fascinating, and the miscommunications. It also reminded me of this New Yorker cartoon. So like I once heard the editor of the New Yorker's or a guy who worked in the cartoon department, right? He was telling a group of us that they used to they had the cartoon caption, right? You send in your own interpretation of what could be said in this sort of absurd scenario, absurd, but like also whatever. And you know, there was, oh no, actually, sorry. I got it confused. Corey Archangel had this project where he did this automated one where every cartoon got like an automatic response, and it was what a misunderstanding. That was the auto caption. Which, and it kind of like worked for a lot of them. And then this was what I was going to say was this guy who used to work there told me that another one that happened, people would send in like who farted instead. That was like the one that was like a blanket. And that
Uh,
one also kind of worked a lot. And, I guess it's just like, between like one has like this, one is empathy, one is comedy, and I just think of like all these things with your own work, just like there's this element of comedy, there's an element of like wanting to try to get in someone else's head, also, and the impossibility of that. Yeah, and just all the it's like then it's just like also your stories feel very New York to me, and I guess it's like, do you feel, you see yourself as a New York writer? Like, do you
I
see?
see myself more as an urban writer.
Mhm.
I think that I don't write uh, stories that come from the farmland or from the West or that seem rugged or something. Although now that I'm talking about it, I'd like to try to write one. It would sort of be like science fiction to me, or social fiction, I guess, geographic fiction. But I don't feel particularly a New York writer, although I'm claimed as a New York writer. I think those divisions, I had a conversation with someone about the problem of the Southern, with Taylor Lewandowski, we've done a conversation book actually that's coming out in June. And the regional writer thing is an interesting problem. You could say an urban writer that's a regional form of writing. Why not? But when a writer is displaced and put in a certain category, that also doesn't allow for that mix of kinds of writing that should be compared. Why not? Why only compare a Southern writer with a Southern writer, or a gay writer with a gay writer, or a Black writer with a Black writer? All of this should be possible to see in relationship. I think people who, I think there's a lot of fear in exposing one's own ignorance. But I think if you start out with the idea that you have ignorance about many things, you're better able to learn. You can't learn if you don't want to expose your prejudices, your biases. I guess that's the same thing. And I think that's very hard. I think that's why many white people are afraid of having a Black character, because they're afraid that they'll do it wrong. And maybe they will. And maybe they will. But how do we get past, in this country, this terrible legacy of slavery? How do we get past that if not by having some courage.
Mm.
White people have to get more courage and more, obviously, understanding, not empathy, understanding. They have to listen more
Mm.
and hear and not be afraid to be wrong. I mean, what's the worst thing? You'll be called a racist? Well, you probably are in some way. I think most white people are, uh, because it's been part of our socialization. You can only get past that if you recognize it. I mean, it's what you learn in psychoanalysis about understanding your own inadequacies, understanding your role in a relationship, and not just thinking you're the victim of it. And these things are hard, but I am interested in that, in trying to get that into my writing. I don't know if I do,
Mm.
but that's a goal.
Yeah. One other question I had too is maybe it's partly related, but so I really love Mother Care, which was your most recent book before this one, and it's a book of nonfiction, and I've recommended it to many people. And there's this idea early on, you say, that your object is to tell a story that may be um, helpful, informative, consoling, or upsetting. And you also talk about having a need to tell what you learned. And I'm curious if how different this approach is to when you're writing short fiction, which, I don't presume that you're wanting to tell what you learned in fiction, right? That's not really of the place for fiction. You've talked about writing just now, also about writing, trying to, maybe start out with a place from ignorance, is there a sort of recovery process of like learning what you actually did know? Is it, do you write to kind of find out what you know or to write through what you know to get somewhere else?
Well, Mother Care, which was about being involved in taking care of my mother for 11 years with my two older sisters, and tries to talk about, or talks about, hospitals, doctors, diagnoses, home care companions as very complex. It's, beyond my capacity at many times, I felt. And you walk into a situation that you are not experienced in at all. You don't know how to handle it. Writing nonfiction is very different for me. And I have to say that writing Mother Care was not difficult to write. It was easier for me to write because there was an object that was already there. I didn't have to compose or make up something about which to write. It was just right there in front of me. And all I could do was use my narrative skills to tell, and my writing skill to tell it in a non-mawkish, non-emotional way that opened up these problems, because it is a huge problem when you have to take care of someone who can't take care of herself. It's bigger than one imagines. Every day there might be something that goes wrong. Every day you're going to be on call. Even if you have somebody with your parent or friend or lover 24 hours a day, you get that phone call. Your mother isn't talking. Your mother can't wake up. Your mother this, your mother that, and you have to run over if you can. And it breaks up your life. Writing, working on a book then, or books then, because it went on for 11 years, I think allowed me to stay sane, or to say, as we call it, centered. I'm not sure what that really means, but I was able to continue to be myself, such as I was. But otherwise, your life, if you're caring for somebody, is not your own anymore, not in the way you had it. And at the beginning, I thought that it would be like raising a child, caring for a child. But of course, a child grows up. A child hopefully isn't losing its memory. It's gaining memory. It's gaining language. It's doing all these things that are hopeful and sometimes wonderful, sometimes not so wonderful. But someone being ill who is in some kind of terminal illness, that that doesn't happen. It's very depressing.
Um, I,
Are
and
we meant to go into a Q&A?
yeah, maybe this is a good time to open it up.
Is
Yeah.
it, Min? Is it the time?
Yeah, we can move on. But if James, if you have a last question you would like to ask, we also have time.
Oh, let me. We can open it up, and maybe I'll come up with it if I have it. I don't want to like stall, but yeah, I'm sure
Okay,
there's some
perfect.
other questions. I can also fill the time if I need to. But
All
yeah.
good. We have a few questions from the audience. Thank you, James and Lynn, for such a wonderful conversation. First question is from an anonymous member in the audience. Can you recall a story in the book that Richard fought to include and one that you fought to include?
That he thought to include,
Was it
and
thought or
Fought,
thought?
fought,
Fox.
fought.
Oh, I don't understand the question.
Um, I'll
Oh,
just read it.
fought
Yes.
to include. Oh, okay. Thought and fought. Let's see. He wanted to include, now I'm thinking back, it was 2 years ago, of course. He wanted to include, God, I can't remember. And I can't remember what I didn't want to include, but I know there were things. I'm sorry, audience member who asked this question. Maybe if I go over my sketchy notes, I could remember. Forgive me.
Our next question is from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thanks so much, Min, and thank you, Lynn and James. This conversation has been so rich and inspiring, and also, Lynn, you're just so funny. I've been just smirking and laughing at so much that you have to say. I loved how you said in the beginning of the conversation that the way you write is not the only way that you could write. I'm interested if you have any advice or just how you yourself get into a space of sort of play in your writing where you can open up and write in a way that is different from how you usually do.
Oh, I think Lynn, I think Lynn might be.
Okay, I did it, I
Okay.
think. Um, I think it comes from my sense of opposition, wanting to do something that would be against a kind of convention or tradition, wanting to disobey. Now, I know to many readers, I don't seem like a rebellious writer because of the way in which I write things. It's more, I don't know, I've been told that my writing is elegant, my writing is this or that. So, and it certainly doesn't seem to be sensational. Actually, I write against all of that. And I want to write well-formed sentences. That matters to me a lot. And I think because things are in the right place most of the time, the adverbs, the adjectives, that people think I'm not writing from the gut. I've been told that some writers talk about writing from the gut. Well, I don't know how they actually do that because it would be mediated by language anyway. I tend not to write out of anger. I think that probably is part of why my writing is the way it is. It's not that I don't feel angry, but I don't want my anger to exclude the readers. The reader has less chance to feel that anger if the author's anger shows. But to the question of writing differently, different subjects seem to require different styles. So my novel, No Lease on Life, is very different from the one that came before, Cast in Doubt, because the characters and the contexts were different. And I don't know if it's very weird to people that I write differently, although the same mind is at work, but it's also a challenge for me. I don't want to be bored. So I try to do different things. I hope that's a good enough answer, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Lynn. Our next question is from Chloe.
Hi, Lynn. Hi, James. Thank you so much for this conversation. Lynn, I can't wait to read Thrilled to Death very soon. I am wondering, I wanted to ask you about attention as a device in your writing, both as a verb, but also as this kind of messy signifier between characters. I feel like attention is this strand in your writing, about it's a way to highlight misunderstandings between characters, how they pay attention to each other, what they miss in each other. It also becomes a way to think about the gluttonous aspects of attention and how it's doled out in day-to-day life. And then in MOTHERCARE, attention is kind of like this weight on the central character you about, when it's unexpectedly or unwillingly given to an ailing parent and at a moment's notice and without warning. And I wonder how you think about attention in your writing and if it's on your mind when you're writing characters and when you're thinking about their relationships with one another.
Well, there are different, thank you, Chloe, for that question. There are different forms of attention. First, there's the writer's attention to writing. And attending to that is, of course, the biggest job. Harry Matthews, the American writer who died not that long ago, he said, the writer is her own first reader. And so that kind of attention to your own writing is absolutely necessary. In my stories or novels, there is, between characters, there's people are hearing or listening to what the other character has said. I mean, in No Lease on Life, the character Elizabeth in a 24-hour novel is hearing what people are saying on the street, or is listening to three people, two of whom are homeless, and one who isn't, but all of them are troubled in different ways. Now, actually, I taped my conversations with them, and no one noticed that these were verbatim conversations, but I was friends then with a young woman who had to prostitute herself, was on the street. Her name was Debbie. And we had become friends, and her life was very troubled, and she'd gone to jail, the same one that what was her name, Jean, who'd killed Dr. Tarnower, I forget her last name, the same Bedford Hills prison. And then there was a man who, Richie, who was homeless, and then somebody took him in on our block, And I talked with him, and he liked his life. And then I talked to a woman who had a place to live, but was very peculiar in different ways. No one noticed. I wasn't making up what they said. I mean, I had to edit it because these were hour or 2 hour long conversations. And I never understood why no one noticed that. So my characters are sometimes hearing being recorded and sometimes not, but they're in conversation with each other. In my novel Cast in Doubt, Horace, the main character, is responding to a young woman. He's in his 60s. This is pre-AIDS. He's a gay man. And he's listening to Helen, who is maybe 19, 20. She's a kind of punk. You know, she comes to the island where he's living. And about 1974, it's a pre-AIDS story about a gay man. I had to think back before AIDS to imagine a future. I mean, there's a lot behind why I wrote this novel, but certainly the death of some close friends of mine from AIDS was a reason. How could I imagine a future? So he gets involved with her and is so interested in her. And one of the reasons is because she's so different from him. So I was playing with that difference between them. He can't really understand her, you know, and people don't, as we were talking about before. So he pays attention to her. She pays less attention to him.
Thank you for that answer, Lynn, and thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Chloe and Elizabeth, and the audience member for brilliant questions. Lynn, should I start sharing the song that you wanted to play at the end?
Okay. This is a song that I love, sung by 3 extraordinary singers, and Leon Russell wrote the song. It's A Song for You, it's called, and Willie Nelson sings, but Ray Charles ends it in one of the most moving concerts I've ever heard, and it always brings me to tears. So I hope all of you like listening to it.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you, Lynn and James, for today's conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Lindsay C. Harris and Theodore Kerr on Recess, an arts organization dedicated to creating transformative cultural experiences. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye, thank you, and goodbye as you leave. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Lynn.
you so much,
James. It
Lynn.
was a joy.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you
you
so much.
Thank you, James.
Fantastic
Bye.
conversation.
That was awesome.
And
Thank you
great
very much.
to listen to it.